I am very nervous. Scared even. When we started discussing the planning for this weekend, I was struck by the fact that nobody was talking about the Eden-Hopefield split. So I decided to talk about it, not because I knew very much, because nobody knows very much. As expected, this is probably the largest crowd for any of my seminars. And I think you're all going to leave disappointed. I already had somebody come earlier today and say, well, go ahead and tell me, why did they split? And I had to say, well, truth be told, nobody knows for sure. But we all have some ideas. So let us consider scared or not scared, fractured community in America. First of all, a little bit of review of Anabaptism for those who weren't here at 9 o'clock. I think Lynn Miller's comment here is as good a summary of the distinctiveness of 16th century Anabaptism as you are ever going to find. Jesus meant what he said, and he was talking to us. For the Catholics, Catholics tended to argue that he was talking to the religious, to the monks and the nuns, but certainly didn't expect you and me to live up to those dominical counsels in the Sermon on the Mount. Protestants argued that Jesus couldn't have really meant what he said because it was so out there. It was so different from what was going on in the world around them that he was either speaking metaphorically or allegorically or talking about some future time. The Anabaptists believed that Jesus meant what he said and he was talking to us. Secondly, I am intrigued by these dualities that I find helpful. I don't know if you will. And I think the Anabaptists did an amazing job of finding balance between them. Balance between faith and works, between behavior and belief. Balance between Christ and Jesus. Now, most people don't like that I make that separation. And I do it largely terminologically. We're talking about the same entity here. But to me, it's a distinction between Savior and example. Christ is the Savior. Jesus is the example. Obviously, we can never live up to behaving totally like Jesus, but it's at least a legitimate aspiration. Ain't no way we're going to live up to Christ. That's a different ballgame altogether. And finally, the difference between vertical and horizontal commitment. Great commandment. Love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And in Mark, Jesus says those two are actually very much like each other. But if you find that you're only playing the vertical game or you're only playing the horizontal game, you got a problem. Anabaptists insisted that you've got to find balance. I should say at the outset that I am not here to ascribe blame, to engender guilt. I'm here to try to understand the impact. Jerome Waldner says one group is more interested in education than the other. One group, interestingly enough, is more interested in predestination rather than free will. Now, predestination and free will are interesting concepts. We didn't talk about this in the first session, but there were only two groups who in the 16th century turned their back on predestination and affirmed free will. Who were those two groups? The Catholics and the Anabaptists. All of the reformers, Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, Martin Bucer, Joachim Vadianus, John Calvin, obviously, were predestinarian. Some of them rigidly predestinarian. Anabaptists and the Catholics both rejected predestination for the same reason. Number one, it would make Jesus the author of, or God the author of evil, because God will have already decided whether you're going to heaven or hell. And secondly, it sort of takes away all of the pressure to try to live a good life. If God's already decided whether you're going up or down, then if it feels good, do it, man. Get down, get funky, because what you do has nothing to do with it. So, to say that one group is leaning toward predestination, the other to free will, Jerome Waldner suggests that both of those are the liberal side, but what we don't know for sure is which side we're talking about. Personal and family tensions. Oh, you gotta love endogamy. And finally, there is real tension between Elder Jacob Stuckey and Peter Crable. Don't know what that is, but there's enough tension that it's referred to the Western District Conference. And some committees at the Western District Conference meet to try to figure out what to do. Elder Jacob Stuckey dies in April of 1893, and before he dies, he leaves instructions for what he wants to happen at Hoffnungsfeld. The Amish Essingen Discipline of 1779 is the document that historians use to verify that these various communities in Europe were Amish. What generally happened is that when they set up a new village, the leaders would sign the Essingen Discipline of 1779. And there you see some of the aspects of it, some of the policies. Notice that Meidung has to be applied to all who've left the truth of the gospel. That is not just excommunication, but shunning was a main issue in the split, in the Amish split to begin with. Holy kiss, young people couldn't cut their beards, simplicity of dress, etc., etc. But Article 3 and 4, James Crable notes that the Essingen Discipline was last formally signed at Edwardsdorf in 1807. Why? Again, this is Dale Schrag theory. I've got mostly questions, not very many answers. Deal with it. Bob Kreider used to say that the questions are much more important than the answers. So see how important I am? Okay, why? Edwardsdorf appears to have been one of the first places that these two groups, the Palatinate people and the Montbéliard people, really came together. I mean, they were living together, which makes one wonder if it was either harder to sign the Essingen discipline, or the Essingen folks thought, well, let's not put everybody through that since we're not all in the same boat. Just a theory. Article 3 and 4 of the Essingen discipline is what I want to focus on, and particularly Article 4. When a congregation is deprived of its leadership, some ordained individual from a neighboring church shall serve the church until new leadership can be secured. So, Elder Jacob Stuckey is still living by the Essingen discipline. He knows he's going to die. He knows what he's supposed to do is find some elder from a neighboring church. He finds two. Jacob Buller from Alexanderville and Dietrich Geddert from Hoffnungsau. Not sure you're aware, but both of those guys are Bloteach. Both of those guys are Low German. And supposedly the Schweitzers and the Low Germans don't get along. Da sind die Philisten. So go figure. He chooses. Now, he didn't have a lot of other options. But I think it's intriguing that he chooses not just one, but two of these guys. Brings no joy. What they're supposed to do is be in charge of Hoffnungsfeld until they can settle their leadership question. But no joy. And on February 5, 1895, the congregation votes to separate, not to split, just separate. So they remain one congregation, but they don't worship together. One worships one Sunday, next the other Sunday. Some people worship when Peter Crable is preaching. Some worship when Jacob Gehring or somebody from the other side is preaching. And then this is the first proscription that I am violating this morning or this afternoon. The minutes say that after this discussion, it was moved not to argue anymore about past incidents, but to put them behind us and to plan for the future. The intention of both sides should be a congenial congregational feeling again. This is going to come again 40 years later in a more prescriptive way. It's incredibly well-meaning, but a little bit naive. I was talking to someone the other day about this, and he said, well, you know, what do you suppose would happen if you told all the people in Kansas who were K-State fans that they could no longer say anything negative about KU, and all of the KU fans that they could no longer say anything negative about K-State? Let's let bygones be bygones. What do you think? Think that would fly? Well, so they had agreed that they were going to stay one congregation. It lasted for 9 days. On February 14, Eden votes to become a separate congregation, and the split is final. Why? This is what I don't know. They're clearly unable to solve the leadership question, even with the help from Western District Conference. Is it an Alsace-Palatinate issue, for those of you who've been here earlier? Is it an Amish versus non-Amish issue? Is it an Amish versus pietism issue? Is it the Gene Bergman thesis? I love this. Some of you may remember Gene Bergman, Elmer Gehring's son-in-law for a time. Gene wrote a senior research paper at Bethel College, and he basically argued it's pretty simple. You got two villages that are held together by Elder Jacob Stuckey. And when Elder Jacob Stuckey dies, there's nothing to hold those two villages together. Or is it all of the above? I am intrigued by the Bergman thesis. The Swiss Volhynians who live here now lived in two villages, Karasufka and Neumanufka. Lindenthal was a very, very small village that had Low German people primarily. These two villages were 3 miles apart. There was a forest in between. They built a church in between the two villages. Each one had its own school. And the whole complex becomes known as Karasufka. If you look in the 1956 first edition of the Mennonite Encyclopedia, if you look up Neumanufka, it will tell you, go look up Karasufka. So how the Sam Hill did that happen? I think it happened because of the Stuckey Gemeinde. I think Elder Jacob Stuckey was authoritative enough that once, he obviously lived in Karasufka, and once it became the Stuckey Gemeinde, it also became Karasufka. Now, how do we know the Neumanufka people cared? Maybe they didn't. But I would turn your attention to the First Mennonite Church of Christian in Mound Ridge. For years I wondered what was up with that. I thought all Mennonite churches were Christian. Christian was a town a mile south, had 5 households. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3 of the founders' first names were Christian, so that's why they called it Christian. It had a store, I think a blacksmith shop, post office, missed the railroad by 1 mile. Died after 12 years. Their church was not a Swiss Volhynian church, it was a Swiss South German church. So why do you suppose they kept that name? They eventually moved to Mound Ridge. There is no other First Mennonite church. Why didn't they just call themselves the First Mennonite Church of Mound Ridge? Or just First Mennonite Church, period. And you're telling me that the Neumanufka people didn't care at all? That they sort of disappeared from the pages of history? I know a lot of you are going to go out to the memorial. I challenge you. I'll give $20 to the first person that can find the word Neumanufka on that memorial. It's not there. Now, why should it be there? Because we've already decided that there's no Neumanufka. If I were a betting man, I guess I just am. If I were a betting man, I would bet that Peter Crable was from Neumann-Ufke. And I'd be inclined to bet that there was a heavier concentration of Palatinate Mennonites in Neumann-Ufke than in Karasówka. Does that explain it? Explain the split? No. I suspect all of those things were a factor. I suspect character and personality played a role here. I'm 1/4 Crable. I know those Crables are hard to get along with. I'm kidding. Please laugh. Okay. So what happens then? Then it gets more complicated. Hoffnungsfeld Eden, as opposed to Hoffnungsfeld Salem, that is the original Hoffnungsfeld, builds a church a half-mile west of Hoffnungsfeld Salem, and Brian Stuckey, bless his heart, has measured it out and marked it out so you can see it if you drive south. But the congregation grows so fast that by 1914 already, they're talking about the need for a new building. And people in both Eden and Hopefield, and they're going by those names by now, begin conversations about the possibility of reuniting and building one great big church. Let bygones be bygones. That split was 25 years ago. We all love each other. Let's do it. These conversations go on, off and on. They're suspended in 1917 for 2 years while the U.S. enters World War I. And then we have one of the truly heroic stories with Mennonites during World War I, and it involves John J. Schrag, Grekahannes, who, an amazing man, a kind of engineering genius, drained the wetlands west of McPherson by digging the Blaze Fork to the Arkansas River. Did it all without a surveyor's level, used algamos, built the Alta mill to grind wheat. They asked him to buy war bonds, and he refused. And one day, a bunch of people from Burton came and picked him up, said there was a speaker in Burton that everybody would want to hear, and they'd like him to hear him. Turned out that it was an attempt to basically force John J. Schrag to buy war bonds. They marched him up and down Main Street, doused him with yellow paint, put him in the little Burton jail, came this close to lynching him. When he was eventually sent to Wichita for trial, the judge dismissed the charges, but said he came this close to violating the Espionage Act of 1917. So, this is a Mennonite hero. Make no mistake about that. 1921, the Philadelphia Society of the Mennonite Church is established. It is established for the purpose of reuniting Eden and Hopefield. Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. People on both sides, both Hopefield and Eden, who are representatives who are serving on the board of this new entity. Most of Hopefield, the records would indicate, tends to be pretty positive about the Philadelphia Society, but not everybody. There are 4 lawsuits filed within Hopefield. 2 of those are against Hopefield pastors. Gustav Enz, the man who baptized my father, and E.J. Neuenschwander, who we just heard about in the Schweitzer's talking. You notice these all involve more than one person. But I want to focus on this one. John J. Schrag and about 5 others versus Jacob D. Schrag and about 5 others. John J. Schrag was Krikahanes, the hero that we've just talked about. Jacob D. Schrag was my great uncle, my grandpa's brother. These 2 men were first cousins. Talk about endogamy. John J. Schrag and his cohorts clearly did not want this reunification to take place. This started, here they are. I was supposed to be at that slide earlier. My apologies. This started a protracted struggle, primarily in Hopefield. As I said, these lawsuits were within Hopefield, all through the 1920s. People got excommunicated. I don't know who. People were not allowed to transfer their church membership to other churches because the church wouldn't give them their church letter. It was ugly. Now, I suspect at least some of you, those of you who didn't know about this, were a little shocked to hear that Mennonites were suing each other within the same congregation. Because Paul in 1 Corinthians 6, and to some extent Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, raises very serious questions about going to court. But Jesus said something else too in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "You've heard it said that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." How about if you just call somebody the devil? In my extended family, I heard that there was a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 or 10, I'm not sure, who heard John J. Schrag referred to as der Teufel so many times that he actually believed that Krikahanes was the devil. Now, how do you suppose those relatives of mine handled Matthew 5:21 to 22? Did they believe that Jesus meant what he said and was talking to us? Yeah, I think they had Martin Luther's position. Well, Jesus must not have truly meant what he said. Both churches request help from the Western District. Western District tried multiple times and were unsuccessful. Finally, they put together an arbitration board in 1934. 3 Western District appointees, P.H. Rickert, H.P. Crable, and John C. Gehring, plus representatives from each church, to agree on reconciliation terms accepted by both congregations. Here are the reconciliation terms. Mutual confession by all parties that they have failed to the spirit of the high godly standard of Christ's teaching. Hard to argue with that one. Any statement made in anything that has been published by either party, which may be derogatory, libelous, as concerning any members of the other party, is hereby retracted, repudiated, and declared to be without force or effect. And I think the stipulation was that those publications should be destroyed. You can still find a few floating around. 3, that all resolutions aimed at penalizing or excommunicating any of said members shall be declared null and void, of no effect or force, and without any retroactive force. So basically it said, hey, we were just kidding. And then there's number 4. It is finally agreed that nothing contained in this writing shall at any time be interpreted by inference or otherwise as leaving room for reviving any of the matters that are considered as settled and forever disposed of by the intent of this agreement. So yes, I am violating Article 4 of the reconciliation terms. It was accepted by both congregations. Now, I find this amazing. Both times, 1895 and again in 1934, this community basically says, let's not talk about this. Let bygones be bygones, don't worry about it. That's what my grandfather did. My dad spent years trying to learn more about this split, particularly the 1895 one. My Aunt Lily Gehring wrote a seminar paper at Bethel on this split. She had my dad translate all of the German minutes. Still no clear answer for what happened. So not only did we order people not to talk about it, people actually didn't talk about it. I'm not convinced that that doesn't have an impact, even if you're not talking about it. Maybe especially if you're not talking about it. I was talking to a church conflict resolution expert some time ago who was talking about a church somewhere east, I don't know how far, and said, oh, this church was concerned about the LGBTQ thing, but they absolutely refused to talk about it. Then they ended up splitting. He said, that's no surprise. You don't talk about it, you're going to split. Don't know if you agree with that or not. We'll have time for discussion. I'd like to close by speaking personally. I told you that Reverend Jacob Stuckey was my great-great-grandfather. He was because his oldest daughter, Katharina, married my great-grandfather, Dale Schrag. There they are. Handsome couple, if ever. Dale Schrag and Katharina had had 10 children who lived. This isn't right. No, this is the first Dale Schrag. Oh well, forget that slide. These are Daniel and Katharina's children. 10 children who survived. My grandpa's the guy with the big ears sitting between his mom and dad. You may be interested to know that if, talking about endogamy, of these 10 children, 5 married their second cousins. 5. Here's my grandpa and my grandma. You see that Anna was a Zerger. Zergers were never Amish. In the Hopefield Eden split, the Zergers went with Peter Crable to Eden right out of the gate. No question. Grandpa, of course, in fact, that whole Schrag family was very, very committed to Hopefield. After all, great-grandpa was married to Elder Jacob Stuckey's daughter. The whole family lived there. Their children were baptized there. My dad was baptized there. So when they got married at Eden in 1907, Anna did what, of course, every good wife does. She joined Hopefield to go to church with her husband. Then in 1933, Grandpa and Grandma moved back to Eden. The first member of that Dale Schrag family to move to Eden. And Grandpa said that he was just too frustrated with all of the virvar in Hopefield. Wedding photo, and these are their children. Again, I was wrong. These are the ones that 5 of them married second cousins. Oh man, this is my third, folks. I've been wearing a mask because my wife has COVID right now. And I don't think I have it, but when Noah Lyles had it, he could only finish 3rd in the 200. So I hope you can offer me some grace too. Okay, these are my aunts and uncles. When Grandpa and his family intended to join Eden, someone, I don't know who, I don't want to know who, started a petition drive to keep them out. They said, the last thing you want in this church is a bunch of Schrags. They will cause trouble. You keep them out. Now, my dad was inclined to sort of dismiss the significance of that, because he said the pastor, C.J. Gehring, found out about it and went to the petition folks and put the kibosh on them and said, you can't want anyone more than that Dan Schrag family in the church. But my Uncle Orland remembers that Grandpa called all of those children together and sat them down and said, there are people at Eden who don't want us to join. I want you to promise me that you will do nothing to cause anyone at Eden to be in any way sorry that we joined Eden Mennonite Church. So keep your head down. Do the right thing always. Don't cause any trouble. They had this good-looking crew. There's a kid in the front, his lip. He doesn't look like he'll be able to keep the sheep in the barn either. Now, I'm intrigued, and I get this from my cousin Tim Schrag, who is not here. Verfallte Mensch. Tim is big into family systems therapy. And he thinks it's interesting that second generation, my parents, my aunts and uncles, there was one missionary, my Aunt Alida, so the sainted one. The men were all farmers. And Tim would say they were all unaggressive farmers. Never considered irrigation, even though neighbors were talking about it. Just sort of kept their nose to the grindstone, had a quarter section, tried to keep their head above water, have a few cows, few pigs. The most creative thing is my dad got sheep, which I had a hard time holding in the barn, and Uncle Eddie had chickens. But other than that, you couldn't have. And then even the third generation, 36 cousins, there are today 2 PhDs, 1 JD, and dozens of master's degrees. Almost everybody has a master's degree. Well, I wonder. Now, there are obviously reasons for this beside Grandpa, calling everybody in and saying, don't be assertive and aggressive. One of those Grandpa's brothers was Andrew Schrag, who went to Bethel, then went off to Haverford, then got a PhD, studied it at University of Berlin, taught German at the University of Nebraska, lost his job because of his position on U.S. entry into the war, started a bank, went bust, and borrowed money from his brothers and never paid it back. Most seriously, was asked to return thanks at a family meal by his mother, and he refused. So there were some questions about PhDs. Humility was goodness. My dad, if you ever said anything to promote yourself, any kind of self-promotion. I got an A on my history test today. His instant response was, That may be true, but it would have been much nicer if someone else had said it. My Uncle Eddie. So I bet some of you can still remember this with Uncle Eddie. Uncle Eddie's favorite word was famous. Famous was not a good word for Eddie. He'd look at somebody, I went to a funeral in this church a week ago, and I wore a suit only because I had just bought it for my granddaughter's wedding, and I thought, well, I don't have very many. I know if Eddie had been here, he would have said, Dale, it looks like you're trying to be famous. Anyway, well, were we the only family so affected by this conflict? I seriously doubt it. But I want to hear from you. You tell me. I'm done. Yeah. Claire, you got a mic? Felice has a question, and I want everyone to hear it.
You were mentioning Stuckey, and he died, but you had mentioned a Gehring. Why didn't the Gehring take over what was Hopefield Church? What happened there? Because you never mentioned the Gehring part of those two guys after.
My father interviewed Reverend Gehring's grandson. Interview in German. There's a tape of it in the Mennonite Library and Archives if you're interested. My recollection is that from that interview, Dad got the impression that Jacob Gehring was sort of a good number two helper. Rarely preached. Spent most of the time, making coffee for Elder Jacob Stuckey. No, was kind of a gopher. So wasn't. Peter Crable, who was the first pastor of Eden, by the way, Peter Crable was clearly a go-getter. He was not told by my grandfather to keep his head down. So that's all I know about Jacob Gehring. Like I told you, I don't know very much.
You spoke about the 1934 reconciliation agreement, but you just touched on that. Whatever became of that? Obviously, it didn't work, but do you know why?
I think it worked very well. Nobody talks about this. That's my point. No, I think it worked amazingly well. I think a lot of the publications did get destroyed. I think the excommunicated people did get back in, and I think the community quit talking about it.
Were the civil suits dropped?
I don't think any of them were successful. One of the suits, this may have been the first one, part of the suit was that Jacob Schrag and those others were members of the board of this Philadelphia society, and the plaintiffs were arguing that you can't, and they were also on the board at Hopefield, were arguing that you can't be on two boards at the same time. And the judge, you know how those judges are, the judge says, look, man, I don't know how you do it in church, But in the world, you can be on as many boards as you want to. So this one's gone. One of them was a suit for $100,000, which I think that was the 1924 one, would have been a considerable amount of money. But I don't think any of them were successful. Bless you.
Dale, my grandfather was C.J. Gehring, and his father was the helper, the Reverend Gehring. And I think he was never, my cousin should tell me for sure, but I thought that he was never, he was an assistant pastor at Hopefield, but never at Eden.
Right.
My grandfather, C.J. Gehring, once said that one of the greatest disappointments of his entire life was that they could not work out this split.
Yeah. It just seemed like such a perfect thing to do. And I just heard from a couple of former deacons at Eden that there was a conversation about it not that long ago. I don't know. You here? When were you a deacon? Wayne Ends, calling Wayne Ends? In the 90s, okay. So it's 30 years ago, but. Folks, it's after 2:30. I told you I didn't know anything, but you listened anyway. I am in awe. Thank you very much.